Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique flashing wings and some of the more important principles, theories, rules, concepts, and strategies of this technique. Okay, so let's start out with the strategy. That's a good place to start. So the general idea of this strategy works with obscure zones. So let's first, before we do this, describe what an obscure zone is. So if you look at your vision, you have a very narrow point which you have focus on. Then outside of that, we have peripheral vision, and then outside of that is what we call the obscure zone. So in this case, what we're going to be doing is taking advantage of the opponent's obscure zone. And how we're going to do that? Well, we get the block, we get the strike, but then we move behind the opponent to get into their obscure zone. And then we're going to go back in front, but we're going to force them to bend over to increase their obscure zone so all they're looking at is the floor so that we can take advantage of it. Okay, so that's the overall strategy. So let's go through a new concept that's equally important in this technique. It's called gauging or controlling the gap. It literally makes this technique work or not work. So how does that work? So let's start out with the two different perspectives here in this situation, which is my opponent, which is second person, and me, which is first person. So let's start out with them. Okay, so they're going to do this punch, we're going to do this block. They could be in a couple different situations. In this case, it could be aggressive or non-aggressive, or stepping further or not further. So in this case, if we look and read the situation, we go, they're at a farther distance, so guess what? I would use a farther weapon. But that's not this situation. This situation is they throw the punch, and they're really close to me. I no longer have access to that long-range weapon, or it's not going to be effective, so I use a more effective weapon, which is the shorter range, which is this elbow. Okay? So that's why we're doing the elbow piece. So now, let's continue with this gauging and moving on to us. So they dictated what we have to do. Now we want to take advantage of it, the fact that they're close to us. So they're very close to us, so it makes it very easy for us to move behind the opponent so that we can get to their obscure zone and then continuing in front of them. But things we can't account for are them moving and situational variations. So that means we're going to have to change our gauges based upon what's going on. So what does that mean? If you think about it, let's turn them this way just to start out with, is I'm going to be moving behind this opponent. So I want to make sure that I'm at proper ranges so I can continue to strike this opponent. So based upon what they're doing, I may have to either elongate or shorten my ranges here. So if I move back here, that's the same thing coming back forward. I don't want to overstep and not get my proper alignments. I want to make sure that my gauges are just proper so that I can execute these motions effectively. So that means I have to maintain and control that gap properly for the situation. Okay? So now that we've done that, let's talk through the next concept. That would be glancing versus angle of incidence. We do glances, that is true, but glances are generally done as minors, not as majors. So what does that mean? So let's take this instance where we started out with this punch and this elbow. If you look at a punch, most people would consider this an angle of incidence, where you're getting that proper alignment, getting everything going, you're doing that punch, and everything is perfect, right? You're hitting that opponent and pushing power through that opponent, right? The same thing should be true for the elbow. You get the proper alignments, you get everything pushing into that opponent, you get everything going forward, right? Because backup mass and gravitational marriage, in this case we're using backup mass, is made possible by alignments. So we want to make sure that we do these alignments. But what does this have to do with the glancing and the angle of incidence? Well, it's obvious for the punch that we have this angle of incidence, but what about the elbow? Remember, we're adding the element of gauging here, right? So one of the problems that usually arises is the fact that you're concentrating on the gauging and not the angle of incidence. So that would mean as I begin to do this rotation, I'm already moving through and I don't apply the proper angle of incidence to this opponent. So you want to make sure you get that hit first and then do your gauging. So this brings in a new concept, the launching piece. So if you contrast the punch is basically getting alignments and getting that punch in place. But we're adding a new element here with the elbow in order to get the obscure zone, and that is launching. So what is launching? Launching is where we're actually moving forward and pushing forward. Okay? So if we break this down to its elemental components, we have a beginning of the launch, a middle of the launch, and the end of the launch. So in this case, we are going to be hitting at the beginning of that launch and the end of the launch. You would say, well, why not the middle of the launch? because that's rule number one. Rule number one says to establish your base. Okay, and if you notice, the beginning and the end is where our base is established. The middle is where the base is not established. So in this case, what's going to happen here is I'm going to do this elbow, and at the very beginning of that launch, I want to get that angle of incidence and then move behind the opponent. And then at the same thing, at the end of the launch, I want to settle into that launch and then get this final strike here. So notice we're purposely omitting the middle of that launch. Okay? So now let's move on to a different concept here. So we're going to turn sideways here. And we're going to talk about diversified angle of retraction, because this is all has to do with this elbow and what's going on with the launching and all the rest. They're all very intricate and intertwined with one another. So what is this diversified angle of retraction thing? So if you'll notice, when we go back to that punch, notice what I'm doing. I'm doing an angle of retraction, but it's a reverse line. But I don't have to take that reverse line. So let's move it into the elbow. I could do it here with the elbow too, but I don't have to do this. And in this case, we don't. What we do is we pull the weapon out at a different angle. And that's what's called the diversified angle of retraction. Okay? I'm retracting the weapon, but I'm doing it at a different angle in which it came in. And so that brings in a new concept. That new concept is with this gauging, we have what's called a path of travel. If you'll notice what we're doing here, we have this path of travel before we do this strike. Well, if we don't gauge properly, we're not going to have a proper path of travel here, so we have to do that gauge so that we have proper path of travel so that we can do a nice solid strike here. Okay? So that's that diversified angle of retraction. And that's that path of travel. So let's move on to a new concept, ratcheting. Okay, so what is ratcheting? Ratcheting in this case is where we're going from a short range to a long range weapon by doing them almost on the same line. So if you notice here, we have two strikes. One here to the scapula, one here to the back of the head, but we're doing it with the same right weapon. In this case, we're hitting once and then extending it to hit with the second one. And that is where ratcheting comes in. Okay? So now, let's move them back this way. So now that we finished all this piece, let's go on to the second piece of this launch. What's going on? So we're doing the launch. We've done the strike here. We're doing the launch. We're getting to where we need to be gauge-wise. And we're going to do this strike at the end of the launch, which gets them to bend down. But the important piece here is what's happening with my right hand and my left leg. Notice, I could either grab or just check this right arm, and I'm taking my knee and I'm checking their right leg. Why? Okay, there's a general rule that says do not leave any loose extremities. So the proper way to really think about it is don't leave any loose extremities that can be used against you. So if you look at their left side, it's pretty far away from me and they really can't use it very well. But their right side, they could. So in this case, I want to pick up that check on the right leg and that right hand as I get to this strike. Okay? Now, I then pick that up again and I pick it up with my left hand. Okay? I want to keep that hand, that's their major hand, under check. Okay? Let's talk about one more thing with the alignments. Remember, alignments make backup mass and gravitational marriage possible. In this case, I want to make sure my alignments are here, going down, and then on the reverse line. I now have line of sight, which means my weapon, if it had eyeballs, would be able to see their face, and in this case, their throat, in order to get this strike. So rather than going down with the alignment using true gravitational marriage, I'm going to reverse that. I'm now going to go up and get the alignments upward on this opponent. Now, if you'll notice, you see the alignments. So this is called gravitational opposition, because I'm opposing gravity and going up, but still using the alignment in order to make it possible. So now that we've gone through all these concepts, let's do the technique fairly quick so that you can see it being executed. Up. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.